table from your data and then create a pivot table from it for a lot of different reasons. Okay. Now, a table is a container of data inside of Excel. Now, I've done a course, actually, we've done 2 podcasts thus far. And again, I'd recommend you check out cpetoday.com, and you could watch for free our class on tables and data modeling. And we've gone through tables extensively, and we're going to continue to discuss tables extensively because they're such a critical component of Excel. But a table and a pivot table are just a match made in heaven. They work so efficiently and well with each other. So a table is a container of data, and it adds kind of a wrapper to your information. And then when you go to create your pivot table, you're not creating your pivot table from the raw data, but you're creating it from the table instead. Now, this is a small but important distinction. If it's in the scope of the table, it's in the scope of the pivot table. Now, this is especially useful for 2 scenarios. The first would be if you've got a dynamic data set. Okay, let's just go ahead and not create a table, and let's just create a pivot table from this just so you can kind of understand what I'm talking about. So with our raw data here, we're going to come over here and we're going to select pivot table, and we're going to click OK. And let's just go ahead and drag our amounts down to values. We'll pull our vendors over here to rows, and we'll pull our date over here to columns. Okay. Now, let's say, for example, we add additional data. Time marches on. We've added new records for this, and I want to go and update it. Well, what I have to do if I have not created a table from my data is come over here to change data source. And you'll notice that there is an absolute reference here. We can see, for example, that it is referencing A1 to 431. Well, that would mean that I would have to come down here, add my new data. Come on, there we go. And I would have to tell it, you know what? Don't go to row 431, go to row 432 in order to be able to include that new row in that record. Okay. So with a pivot table, if we don't create a table, if we expect our data set to grow, we have to redefine the data source by coming up to our pivot table analyze and selecting change data source. So we don't want to do that. So as a best practice, though, if we instead create a table, and then from that table we create our pivot table, we're going to save ourselves a step in the future if that data set is going to grow. Okay, so let's go ahead and create our table first, and we're going to do so by coming up here to the Insert menu. And from that Insert menu, we are going to go ahead and select Table. Okay, and it's going to ask us where does the table start and stop. In this case, A1 to 431. And we're also going to indicate that our table has headers. And we're going to go ahead and click OK. A dead giveaway that you're working with table data inside of Excel is the fact that they always come pre-styled like this. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into the 100% of the merits of tables, but the one thing you need to know about a table and a pivot table in conjunction with each other is that a pivot table will use the table as a data source, and a table is dynamically sized. Meaning, if we add a new column over here, let's say, for example, we add a column called tax year. Okay. Notice that the style extends into that column. Okay. Let's say we write the formula of year. Okay, and we pointed at our check date over here. Notice that when we rank that new field, that column will automatically replicate with the formula contained inside of it. Okay, so pivot tables will use the table data, and if new data gets added, like a new column, or if we come down here and let's just say we add a new row as an example, okay, that new row would automatically be in the scope of the table, which then automatically puts it in the scope of the pivot table. So always consider this a law. When you want to create a pivot table, create a table from your data, then create a pivot table ultimately. So let's go ahead and take a look at creating a just simple pivot table from a table. So we're going to come up here to our Insert menu. And from our Insert menu, we are going to create our pivot table from this Insert menu. And you'll see it listed right there that you can use to create this pivot table. Okay. Now, I do want to draw your attention to recommended pivot tables too. If you're just getting started and you want to find some different ways that you can organize your data and you don't know exactly how to use a pivot table just yet, one of the cool things about recommended pivot tables is that it will give you some examples of what your data could look like. It will scan your data and will give you some examples of how to use it. So, for example, here we can see sum by account by vendor, sum by amount by account, so on and so forth. But it's a great way just to get started with our pivot table. Okay, so let's just create a normal pivot table. And again, that's going to be from the insert menu, pivot table on the left, and here we go. Okay. Now, what I want you to notice here, when we go to create our pivot table, a couple of important things. Notice that when we create it from a table, it has the name of the table. Table 2 in this particular example. If we want a more meaningful name, if we just back out a little bit and come over to our table design menu and instead select check register and give it the name of check register, we can do so in the upper left-hand corner of that table design menu. So I can give it the name of check register. And in fact, from a table's best practice, you should always give it a fairly representative name. Okay. And also from that table design, you'll notice we even have a shortcut here. Ooh, secret shortcut in terms of what you can create your pivot table right here as well. And you'll notice when we give it a better name instead of table 2, you'll see check register is what pops up. Okay. Again, anything in the scope of that check register table will now be in the scope of that pivot table. Okay, we can connect our pivot table to an external data source. We'll talk about that later on, as well as use the workbook's data model. And you'll even notice down here at the bottom of the pivot table, there's a checkbox that says use the data model, use this data in the data model or add it to the data model. More on that. And in fact, if you watch our tables course, we're going to discuss that in depth because data modeling in Excel, it's so wonderful and works so efficiently. But we're going to just create a good old generic pivot table just using our table data. And we're going to go ahead and click OK here. So there you go. That is what it looks like to ultimately just